And welcome to College Football Tradition, a history of American college football. My name is Brian Partiga. I'm joined alongside my co-host and bro-host, Jacob Vanderford. We are here to talk about the second season of American college football, and that is in 1870. And we are really going to be discussing the Princeton Tigers and that dynasty really forming and starting in this year, because there was so much going on in the sport during the early days in terms of rule changes and what the sport was going to look like moving forward. But there were only a few teams at the time. So we knew Princeton and Rutgers played in 1869. They played twice to victories, a victory for Rutgers at Rutgers, a victory for Princeton at Princeton, and a third game was never played. So we had two champions in 1869. But in 1870, Columbia joined the mix. So just 60 miles away, from Princeton, New Jersey, Columbia was beginning their college football journey. But only two games were played in 1870, and Rutgers competed in both of them. So they defeated Columbia, and then they lost to Princeton 6-2. So Princeton now on a two-game winning streak against Rutgers at the time. So Rutgers went 1-1 on the year, Columbia 0-1, and Princeton 1-0. Jacob, what are some of the things that stood out to you when it came to that 1870 college football season?
Yeah, so I can kind of run through some of the rules that you kind of saw starting to take place between these three teams. As we talked about in the first episode, 1869, there weren't really a ton of rules. Like Brian kind of discussed, they kind of just depended on where you were, if you were playing at Princeton, playing at Rutgers. So we saw more of the rules come into play. And so the rules at the time were based on some of the football rules that were published by the London Football Association in 1863. So we're kind of going back a little ways and looking at these rules. These rules are sort of a precursor to kind of the modern rules of football or soccer, and they included some elements of rugby as well. So that's kind of more where that evolution of where we see the tackling and the some of the penalties and things like that come into play more from rugby than from soccer. Also during this time, teams could start scoring goals by kicking a round ball between two goalposts on a goal line. So this is kind of where you see again like that development of a line of scrimmage. You saw the two goalposts finally kind of coming into play rather than the typical soccer net. So that's kind of how you scored those points. And the ball was advanced by kicking it, and passes to players in front of the ball were not permitted. So that's one of those things where, you know, how in college football today, you can only pass laterally if you're past the line of scrimmage. This is kind of where you kind of saw that come into play at a very early time when you couldn't pass the ball in front of you if you were past that line of scrimmage already. So that's another rule that was interesting to me. Under these rules as well, any player could catch a ball that had been kicked or had bounced only one time, but could not run with the ball. Following such a catch, that player could pass the ball to another player or have a free kick from that spot. If a ball passed the goal line without going between the posts, the team whose player touched it first was awarded a free kick. So going back, if you listen to our first episode of this series in 1869, you see that free kick. That's how that free kick kind of comes into play within these first rules. If that team was the defending team, the free kick was taken from the point on the goal line closest to where the defending team touched the ball. If that team was the attacking team, it took the free kick from the spot that was 15 yards from the point on the goal line closest to where the attacking team touched the ball. These rules left some certain fundamental rules of the game unspecified. Rules did not specify the size of each team, the duration of the game, or whether play could be subject to breaks.
That's
So you didn't.
crazy. So when
So
we
you
talk
didn't.
about quarters and timeouts and number of players on the field, I mean, absurd.
Yeah, and yeah, I mean you didn't have any of that at the time, and so like you didn't have like timeouts or halftime or things like that in college football that we see today that are just so imperative and crucial to the advancement of the game. Yeah, and like not having like the 11 players on the team, it just seems like there's so many vague entities to the game. And these were agreed by the teams. Based on where they were, who the home team was, the rules of that game were agreed upon that prior to each game. And then the rules introduced a certain uniformity to the rules of college football, but much like football played in English public schools at the time, the actual rules applied varied somewhat game to game. So you kind of saw game to game, the rules could kind of be kind of manipulated or fixed or some of those things. And so there wasn't really any specificity to the game of college football here in 1870.
No, not at all. I mean, that's so interesting. Thank you for, recapping all of those different rules that were going on at the time, just to give our listeners a glimpse of what the sport looked like. And I mean, unless you got to the other side of your opponent's territory, you didn't really even have a chance to score because you had to kick it through the goalpost at the time. Like that was how you rewarded points. So when we see these low scores like this, like how Princeton beat Rutgers 6-2, that isn't a touchdown and a safety. That's 6 goals to 2 goals. So really interesting way to play football, and obviously we'll see that there's a lot of changes to it. But of those 3 teams in 1870, Princeton was the only one that was retroactively named national champions. And I say retroactively, meaning at the time nobody named themselves champions at the end of the year. Nobody claimed national titles. But afterwards, the Billingsley report, the National Championship Foundation, and of course, college football historian Park H. Davis, they all named Princeton the retroactive national champions for 1870. And Princeton is also the only university that claims an 1870 national title. Nobody else takes claim to it. So I think that they are in their rightful place in history as the 1870 national champions. And they are also our college football tradition national champions. Jacob, I don't know if you had a differentiating opinion with Rutgers being the only team to have played both. I felt like, Rutgers kind of got the short end of the stick here. And Columbia, they didn't even get a chance to play Princeton that season.
Yeah, I mean, you just kind of have to give Princeton the win, I think, just based off of their undefeated season, and that's kind of how we see things today too. I feel like the team that has the least amount of losses usually typically gets the highest seed, but that also is based upon various different elements, whether that's like the conference that you're in, your strength of schedule, things like that. But if you look at this time, there wasn't really any strength of schedule. Like you literally had 3 teams that you could play, and 1 or 2 teams that you could play against. It's also interesting to me looking at, like you talked about, the Billingsley reports, the National Championship Foundation, Park H. Davis. Like those were kind of your AP poll and your coaches poll at the time as well. So it's interesting to kind of see as we look back at this time how much those rankings and those polls have evolved. Another couple things that I wanted to throw in there. It's interesting how these were the 3 teams that were kind of considered to be the teams of the era, but there are also considered intramural football that was happening at this time. So in Vermont, in Vermont, they had a freshman and sophomore class football game similar to ones that we were talking about on the 5th of October. And then at Dartmouth, it's interesting. In the fall of 1870, around October 29th, they initially banned the sport. And then you kind of saw that as well at Yale and Harvard. They banned the game outright there on October 31st on Halloween. So like there was also apparently an arrest, as I'm reading here. A Yale student was arrested after a group of sophomores were caught playing football on the New Haven Green. And after the arrest, a group of 200 students gathered outside the police station, and 1 student was seriously injured after being clubbed over the head by a policeman. So it's insane how much a game like football was seen to be like blasphemous and something that like shouldn't be played at the time. You need to stick to your studies and the university and more of the proper things. And people kind of thought, a game like football was more like savage or like something like that. So yeah, it's interesting to kind of read more about that side of the history too.
Yeah, yeah, it's so interesting. And I'm glad that you brought up how different schools were kind of banning it, and also how different classes at schools, like at Vermont, when different freshmen and sophomore, they would have a game. Those things still kind of happen today. And I think that that's really evolved into our spring games.
Yeah.
But a lot of schools were popping up at the time, having inter-conference games just with each other, and just like in their own little in their own campus world. So obviously they weren't playing other institutions at the time. But so I thought that that was really interesting that you brought that up, because we'll also see that in the next season, kind of to prelude our 1871 episode of the season that never was. So college football did not exist in that season, as there were different conflicts taking place in different schools that were putting bans on the sport. And a lot of teams couldn't really travel, as we've already seen, to visit other teams to be able to play the great sport that we know today. Yeah, any final thoughts on 1870 before we wrap it up today?
I love a crash course. Like I said in the first episode, we're learning as much as you are learning with us, and so hopefully we can all learn more about college football, this great sport that we know and love, the history of it, the traditions of it, and we'll keep learning more about it as we go in this season. But yeah, super excited to keep this series going with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, for Jacob Vanderford, I'm Brian Partika, and this is the 1870 version of college football tradition. We will see you next time.
CFB you later.